Before I start, what you're about to see is a piece of storytelling. I know some of you have encountered storytelling before and some of you haven't. Storytellers know their stories really well, their traditional repertoire. These are stories that go way back, hundreds of years, thousands of years. We know the stories really well, but we never learn the words. So each time we stand up to tell a story, we tell it from the beginning. We find new words, we find new ways through the tale. So what happens tonight is all about you and me and this moment. I will never tell this story in the same way ever again. So that's something to think about. Thank you. Yes, this is Janet's baby. There's 24 maidens fair, playing at the chess, and Janet walks among them all, as green as any grass, as green as any grass. Janet walked up and down the hall, pacing between the lassies who bent over their chessboards. They were only pretending to play chess, they weren't really. Actually, they were whispering and gossiping and sniggering and pointing and then pretending to play a move, a really serious move, something involving a knight, whenever anyone looked at them. But they weren't really. They were talking about Janet. Janet, who walked up and down that hall, lost in her own imagining. But there was something strange in her walk today, something awkward, unusual in the hang of her gown. And the lassies watched and the lassies whispered among themselves. Everybody knew. Really, everybody. There's 24 maidens fair, playing at the ball, and Janet was first among them once, but now she's last of all, but now she's last of all. The lassies gathered on the green place beside the tower to play at the ball, and I know you don't know what I'm talking about. So when I say they were playing at the ball, when the ballad says they were playing at the ball, the ballad means football, which is just fantastic. There are not enough ballads about football. And when I say football, I need you to stop imagining 11 highly groomed men running up and down for 90 minutes. That is not how football was played in the old borders. In the old borders, football was a game that you played among your own folk, among your family, your household, your village, and you all gathered together and you divided yourself into two teams, enormous teams they could be. You could play the top end of the town against the bottom end. You could play the bachelors against the married men. You could play, best of all, the boys against the girls. And when you had divided yourselves up, everybody gathered in one central place, toe on the line, eyeing each other up, trying to look menacing, probably succeeding in looking menacing because this was the borders, and there are some things we do very well. And then a great leather ball would be tossed high into the air and it would come down spinning, and then the fun really began. Because in this game of football, you reached out with your hands and you grabbed the ball, you held it tight, you dropped your shoulder, you went running towards the opposite team as hard as you could, and they came running at you. There was nothing polite about this game. There were almost no rules. There was certainly no pitch. The game went up the hill and down the lane, over cobble, over stubble, over moss. There were no goalposts. You scored goals by hefting the ball high into the branches of the trees, by plunging it deep into the fast-flowing river, and there was no referee with a whistle. This game did not end at 90 minutes, okay? This game ended only when darkness came tumbling down among the players and they went limping and bruised and bleeding back to their own firesides for a very well-earned cup of ale. That was football in the old borders. And that was Janet's favourite game. She loved it. She always wore a pair of big heavy boots under her skirts in case there was the chance of a game to be had. She had long fly-away curly hair, but she wore it plaited close to her skull so that nobody could grab her hair in the scrum. She was thinking hard. She loved it. She loved the press and rush and sweat and grapple of it. She loved the sweet strangeness of being lost among your own folk. Janet loved to play. Are you getting this? Janet. So it was strange, and it was something more than strange that today, although the lassies gathered to have a game on the green, Janet didn't play. Janet stood back. She stood apart. She said, "That's fine, I'll just watch." It was strange. It was so strange that Janet's father, an old reaver, an old robber, white of hair and rough of tongue, came to stand behind her shoulder to say, "Janet, lass, is all well with you? Is all right? Is something amiss?" And Janet answered, as teenage girls across the history of the world have answered, "I'm fine, stop pestering me, I don't want to talk to you, there's none wrong, can you just go away?" Some things do not change. But as much as she pretended to be watching the football, and as much as she pretended that everything was fine, her eyes betrayed her. Janet's eyes kept straying from the match in front of her to a place just at the top of the slope, where the meadow meets the woods, the place where here meets there. Carter Hall Woods. You did not go to Carter Hall Woods. There were songs about it. There were stories about it. There were ballads about it that you learnt at your mammy's knee when you were a tiny child. You do not go to Carter Hall Woods. Very simple, right? Where do you not go? Very good, you are learning. You do not go to Carter Hall Woods. It is very simple. Everyone knew it was forbidden. But to Janet, but to a teenage girl with fire in her belly and a lust for adventure in her heart, well, a prohibition was as good as a written invitation. It might as well have been a written invitation. And so one night at twilight, she went stepping quick and soft over the stream and up the bank till she came to the edge of the meadow, till she came to the place where here meets there. The woods were deep and green and damp and very still. And though the tree branches were full of birds, no bird sang there, no bird cried. But Janet wasn't afraid. She lifted up her skirts and she stepped softly into that deep, dark strangeness. And then another step. And then another, deeper and deeper into the heart of the wood. And at the very centre of the wood, she found a well of slate-grey water. A well of grey water that was completely still. And she looked down into the water. And she saw her own face reflected there. And she looked at it for a while. It was familiar. It was strange. And then a ripple crossed the surface of that grey water, and when Janet looked again, there was another face reflected beside her own. Him. Tamlane. She knew him by the dancing light in his eyes. She knew him by the slenderness of his waist. It was a very nice waist. You might want to take a moment to imagine. It was very nice. She didn't ask his name. She didn't need to ask his name. She knew he had a dozen names, a different name in every story, in every song, as many names as a tree has leaves. She didn't say anything at all. She just stared at that eye, at that waist. And he stared back. And sadly, ladies and gentlemen, at this point the ballad gets very, very coy. Suddenly the ballad starts to behave like someone's Victorian grandma. It does not want to give you the juicy details. He's took her by the milk-white hand, among the trees so green, but what they did I cannot say. The leaves they were between, the leaves they were between. between, I know, what a cop-out. He's took out by the milk-white hand, among the roses red, and what they did I cannot tell, but she's ne'er returned a maid, she's ne'er returned a maid. Nobody said, but everybody knew. As summer ripened into autumn and Janet's belly grew big, everybody knew. You could tell because of the whispering, the pointing, the sudden giggling that went quiet when Janet entered the room. Everybody knew that Janet had a baby inside her, and she didn't have a man to call its father. This was a problem, but it was not a problem that obviously had a solution. So people watched and waited and whispered and pointed and giggled, and the year wore on. And soon, it was Halloween. And I'm sure you know, Halloween is the night of the year when the other worlds that adjoin this one come very close, kissing close, when strange creatures from other realms come creeping and crawling into this one, all our worst nightmares suddenly loose in the darkness for the night. Sound familiar? Okay. What might sound a little bit more familiar is that on this particular Halloween night, Janet's father gave a great party. A gigantic party in the hall. There was eating and drinking, music and dancing, laughing and flirting. There was, well, everything that's fun. As things got a little bit later on, there was even some quiet fucking in a dark corner, but everyone was definitely you got to do it somewhere, haven't you? But the best thing of all, unless you were one of the people in the corner, in which case, the best thing of all at the party were the guisers, were the dancers in disguise who came in fancy dress, in monstrous shapes, as witches, as ghosts, as demons, as fairies, all whirling in the firelight, casting fantastical shapes and scaring people half to death. Around the floor they danced and whirled, and in the heart of the dance was the most feared figure of them all, the most dreadful of all the creatures that haunted the borderlands, the elvish queen, in a deep green gown. If you're interested, it was Janet's second best gown that they borrowed for the night and laced very loose. And the long yellow hair was a wig made of straw, but shh, don't spoil the effect. In the centre of the hall, the elvish queen danced and whirled, the figure, the centre of everyone's terror. She it was who sent her servants with elf boat and bow to poison people's cattle. She it was who sent her servants dancing in honest men's barley fields so the crop failed and the folk starved. She it was who on quiet nights would slip through the crack in a poor man's cottage wall to steal a pretty bairn away from its mammy, away from its fireside. And so she danced around the hall that Halloween night, reaching out long, grasping fingers for all the prettiest children at the party, threatening, I'll have you, I'll take you from your mammy. And the poor little children, who'd only had a little bit of beer to drink and so weren't very brave, went screaming and weeping back to their parents' knees. On and on the party wore, and the dancing grew wilder and more fierce. But then there was a change. Then something happened. Then the young men, the guisers, went into a sudden huddle in the corner. And I'm sure you've been at parties where young men have suddenly gone into a corner. And there's that kind of scuffling and muttering and whispering. You know the kind of thing I mean? You know someone is about to come back without his trousers on. You just know. It was one of those little huddles in the corner. And then they came back. And then they danced as if nothing had changed, the elvish queen at the heart of it all. But as Janet watched, she realised there was something strange about the shape of the elvish queen, something ungainly, something ugly about the hang of her gown. She was fat, she was grotesque, she was... Oh, God! Someone had shoved a jerkin up the elvish queen's dress, so now she was grotesque, she was pregnant. She was Janet. And this grotesque guy of a Janet went stumbling and shambling around the hall, but instead of reaching out for the children, now she reached out for all the handsome young bachelors, crying, a daddy for my babby, a daddy for my babby, a daddy for Janet's baby, a name for Janet's baby. And Janet watched approaching, felt the fury rising in her belly. Her father leaned across. Her father touched her on the elbow. He said, "Janet, lass, they're drunk. Let it go." As so many northern fathers have said before. Always with exactly the same result. Because Janet knew perfectly well that they were drunk. They wouldn't have dared do it otherwise. But she was drunk as well, goddammit. And so she rose to her feet and she brought her wine cup banging down so hard that the whole hall fell silent. And they stared in sudden trembling to see what she would do. And she cried out, "You cowards! You bunch of cowards! You less than men! How dare you! There's not a man of you. There's not a man in all this hall that I would have to be the father of my child, to give my child its name. Not one. Not if he came crawling. Not if he begged. Not one of you is worthy me." And she spat her contempt into the middle of them. And like a good northern woman, she stormed right out into the night. And like all drunk northern women, she didn't really have a plan. But when you've stormed out, you've committed. You've got to see it. So she didn't stop to think. She just carried on. And where else was there to go? Across the stream and up the slope to the edge of the meadow, to the place where here meets there. The woods were even more silent by night, even darker, even more deep and more strange. But Janet didn't care. Janet was full of beer and wine and fury, and she charged straight in, and she did not step silently this time. She trod on every twig between here and Glasgow. She didn't care how much noise she made. She didn't care how much rolling around pregnant and drunk she woke every wild creature in the county. She didn't care. So it was no surprise that he had heard her coming. It was no surprise that he stood there waiting beside that well of slate-grey water, with a mocking smile on his lips. She laid her hand on her belly. She said, "I need a name for my child. I need a father for my child. I need a name for my child. A man's name. Are you laughing at me?" "No. I'm not laughing. Why would I laugh? Anyway, I've got lots of names. Have one of those. I've got a different name in every song, a different name in every ballad, as many as a tree has leaves." But Tamlane saw a certain fury in Janet's eyes, and he decided that a slightly more helpful conversation might be called for. Smart boy. So he said, "Long ago, so long ago it might have been a dream, I remember a morning in spring with the sun on my face and the wind in my hair, and I remember that morning I rode, a man among men, and I had a man's name. And I could have again, I think, if you have a strong arm and a bold heart." Let me explain. Or better yet, let me show you. Because time moves strangely in ballads, twisting and stretching itself to fit the shapes of our fancy. So let's go reeling backwards. Let's swoop back in time like the swallows circling over the moor to that morning in spring, a very long time ago. It was one of those mornings where the air is cold, where it sends a shiver down your spine, which I know is impossible to imagine right now, isn't it? But try. It was one of those mornings in spring where there is a scent of greenness in the air that tells you the year has turned, that tells you that things are growing. And on this fresh spring morning, I need you to picture horses and hounds and men and hawks. I need you to imagine laughter and the smell of beer and the smell of wet dogs and the smell of well-used leather and not very often washed men. I need you to imagine the kind of laughter you hear when men get together in a group and they know there are no women for miles around, and there aren't going to be any women for miles around for the whole day. One of those days. The men were getting ready to go hunting. And Tam was so pleased and proud to be riding with his uncle that spring morning. He was just in the borderland between being a boy and a man, and proud to ride with the men for the first time, and excited to be out in the sunshine and the fresh air and the spring breeze that seemed to blow away all the shadows that had haunted the edges of his brain for 3 whole years now. They seemed to blow away. It was good to be out on this spring morning. And away they rode, with some singing, some dirty jokes, you know, the usual things, some conversation about last weekend's football and who had cheated, and, well, everyone had cheated, obviously. It was quite a long conversation. But as they rode, something changed in that green, fresh spring wind. Suddenly there was a shard of ice in its touch. Suddenly it was a cold that chilled you to your bones. And suddenly there was a great gust of northerly wind. And a yellow bush of broom shook so hard it was like a hand had lifted it in the air and shaken it deliberately. And that flash of yellow broom, it must have spooked Tam's horse, because the horse began to shy, and then Tam fell from its back. He landed on the ground. He looked. He saw he'd cut his hand open on a stone. He looked up, waiting to see his uncle and all the other men ready to laugh at him for the rest of his life. But between the falling and the landing, something had changed. And men and horses and hounds, they were all gone. And all that he could see, standing beside the bush of yellow broom, was a woman, her golden hair cascading over a green gown, and her eyes dancing fire bright, and her voice, when she spoke, was sweet as honey. She said, "Oh, you've hurt your hand. Let me see." And Tam held out his hand. It was trembling a little bit. There was a thick pool of blood beginning to circulate in his palm. It was thick, it was salty, it smelled like that night. It smelled like the night he had tried year after year to forget. It smelled like the night that the farmhouse had burned around them, blackening and crackling, while his mother lay dead in her blood in the centre of the kitchen floor. But when he looked at the lady, all that was forgotten. When she took his hand in hers and said, "Shall I tell you a fortune?" She stared at his messy, bloody hand for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, I see your future. Shall I tell you? I see you becoming like the men you ride with. I see you becoming a reaving lord among the reaving lords of the borders. I see a life of raid and feud and skirmish and battle. I see your fair flesh crisscrossed with half-healed scars. I see your hand growing coarse from handling sword and spear and ill-won treasure, and one dark night I see an ending, sudden and bloody. I see black blood pooling out among the shadows of the moss. I see your brain cracked open, spilling its soft insides like the tender inner parts of a snail when a thrush has cracked it open. I see the corbies, the ravens, the black scavenger birds of the borders coming to feast on the soft parts of your body before dawn breaks. I see all that. That's your future, she said. Tempting, I know, isn't it? And as she spoke, Tam could see it all before his eyes, and somehow it was all mixed up with those memories from 3 years ago, with his father lying in the pre-dawn grey light, with a hole in his face where his eyes should have been, where the scavenger birds had already been at their work. He saw it as freshly as if it lay before his eyes now. But the lady seemed not to notice. The lady carried on. "I know a place," she said, "beyond time, beyond change, where a ripple crossing the skim of a well is all that moves in 100 years, where your heart will beat as slow and safe as a jeweled toad asleep inside a stone. Will you come, young Tam? Will you come with me?" And he had no words. He had nothing to say. But torn between the nightmare and the dream, he nodded his head. "And so," he said, "that's how I come to be here. That's how I come to be in this wood. And I would gladly have stayed here forever, never aging, never knowing fear, never knowing doubt, never knowing death. But tonight is Halloween night. And tonight the Queen must pay a debt to hell. She must pay the finest and fairest of all her servants, and I'm afraid, said Tam, who was never very modest at the best of times, I'm afraid that she will choose myself. Unless, he said, unless I had some friend with a strong arm and a bold heart, some friend who was brave beyond imagining. Janet, will you dare to play a game of transformations? Will you dare to risk the wrath of the elvish queen on Halloween night? Because she'll punish me. If I try to escape, she'll punish me, transform me into all sorts of dreadful shapes. Make me adder, make me Todd, make me fire, make me dove, make me swan, make me, I don't know, a husband. What? A husband. If I play your game of transformations, will you be transformed for me? Will you become my husband? Will you become the father of my baby? Will you give my child your name? Well, he wasn't ready for that one. He played for time. He ran his finger through the water of the well, making the surface choppy so their two faces shattered into pieces, and went dancing about, seeking the other parts of themselves amid the chaos. But after a moment, he said, all right, ever the romantic, all right. Yes, if that's your price, yes. It was midnight. Janet hid herself close to the old stone cross that stood at the place where two roads meet, beside the river where the bridge crosses its quick-flowing streams. She was sober now, and this was not necessarily an improvement, as it meant that she was freezing cold, as it meant that she was suddenly terrified. She couldn't stop her body from shaking. She had nothing left to her now but fury and pride and determination. Determination to play the game of transformations. Determination that she would bloody well win. But it was cold, and she was afraid, and she shivered. Particularly when she heard afar off the muffled clink of a bridle, the thud of hoof on turf, and she knew the elvish queen and all her servants were coming closer. She hid back among the shadows. And she saw them come riding one by one, with the elvish queen at the head of the procession. And the elvish queen was beautiful. Her green gown seemed to glow with its own light. Her eyes were like two candles in the darkness. But the servants who rode behind her, they were horned and hoofed and tailed. They came in every shape you can imagine, every shape you've ever seen in dream or in nightmare. And some of them came from places stranger than that. And at the very back of the procession rode him, Tamlane, pausing now and then to fiddle with his harness or to pull off his glove. And Janet knew that was her moment, that was her chance. And she darted forwards and she threw her arms around his waist and she held on hard and she heaved with all her might, so he came tumbling off his horse. So they fell, the two of them, locked in each other's arms on the stones of the road, and they lay there for a moment, winded, wondering what would happen next. And for a moment, nothing did. And Janet thought, is that it? Is that, he gave me that great build-up about a game of transformation, and is that it? Oh, for God's sake, men are such babies. Is that, she could have laughed with relief. Is that all? But then she saw two burning eyes in the sky above her, and then the air was thick with something that smelled cloying like honey, and then there was laughter in her ear, and the voice of the elvish queen saying, no, the game has not begun, but now it will. And the elvish queen's laughter filled the air, and Janet's arms that had been full of slightly winded and confused man were empty, except for a writhing mass of muscle that thrashed with fury, with a great long adder the length of herself that wrapped itself around her body, that squeezed and thrashed with a fury, its diamond head writhing about and spitting venom, so she had to hold it with all her might to keep its poison from her eyes, while the beast wrapped itself around her body and squeezed all the breath out of her. Then the Queen's laughter was in the air again, and what had been adder became Todd, became fox, a fox with a mouth full of teeth like pins and needles that launched itself at her in the darkness, the stink of its muzzle close in her face, the heat of its breath on her cheek, its claws reaching out to scratch her face, to rake out her eyes, and she held it with all her might. And then that laughter again. And what had been fox was now fire. Janet held, oh my God, Janet held a handful of fire, and she knew that she could not let this go. She knew she dare not let this go. So she held on with all her might while her hands burned and blackened and spat, and the skin spat open, and her arms charred, and her whole body became one screaming mass of pain, a mass of pain that could not remember its own name, its own shape, or the purpose of this hellish game that she seemed to have begun. She held on to that fire while she smelled the stink of her own burning and could think of nothing but the pain and her determination to hold on, to win this goddamn game, whatever it was. And then the fire was gone. What had been fire was now the frantically beating heart and soft breast of a dove that tried to flutter away out of her hands. But she reached and she grabbed it and she held it hard, her heart beating as fast as its own. And the two of them together were still for a moment. Then what had been dove became swan, a giant swan that kicked and spat and thrashed at her with its great wingspan and tried to push her backwards into the water where she might be lost. And she threw all of her weight against his. And on it went, transformation after transformation, change after change, and all the while the Queen's laughter on the air, sickly sweet scent of honey, the Queen whispering in her ear, Janet, let him go, and Janet knowing nothing but she must refuse, screaming her rage into the night, crying out, no! And then something changed. At last, after a night that seemed to last a century, another cry answered her own across the dark sky, the cry of cockcrow, splitting the morning new open, and the grey light of dawn began to smear into the darkness. And the scent of sweet cloying honey was gone from the air, and the Queen's laughter was gone from her ear, and her arms that had held some furious thrashing mass of beast were, oh good God, were holding a man, flesh and blood and warm, a man, a naked man, oh good, bonus. But the shock of it sent her stumbling backwards, and sent Tam stumbling backwards with her, and they both fell with a great splash into the cold stream of the river. And very slowly, wearily, the two of them climbed out of that river and stood dripping and freezing and shivering on the riverbank, in the cold grey light of the dawn. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and to each of them the other seemed both familiar and very strange. And there was a wedding. You will be glad to hear, as in all the best stories, there was a wedding. And it was a very fine wedding indeed, even though Janet was so big by this point that she threatened to split the seams of her new gown, even though her arms were still bandaged to the elbow and there were scars on her face that would never leave her live as long as she would. Even so, it was a very fine wedding, even though Tam stood behind Janet, silent and flinching at any sudden noise, any movement, any sudden dart of light, as if the world were too much, too strange for his senses. I know that would have done for him. He'd have been out of the room if you dropped that. He was very, very flighty on his wedding morning. But nonetheless, the wedding was completed. They were man and wife, and even better yet, as far as everyone else was concerned, there was a party. Yes. There was eating and drinking, there was music and dancing. Later on there would be quiet fucking in the corner. Yes. It was always like that at parties on the borders. That's where the next wedding comes from. But best of all, the geysers came again, disguised in fantastical whirling shapes in the firelight. And tonight they danced a new dance. Tonight they danced the dance of Tamlane. They danced the gulling of the elvish queen. They danced the game of transformations. They danced Janet and Tam united, triumphant, and in love. And that night, everyone in the hall reeled to bed very, very drunk. What a good party. And almost everyone reeled drunkenly to bed happy. But a rough wooing, no matter how fine and fierce, is never the same thing as a marriage. And I can't help but wonder what became of them, Janet and Tam, in the years that came after. I can't help but wondering how long did those two, ill-assorted, manage to stay together. Time is a strange thing in ballads, twisting and stretching itself into the shape of our fancies, so call it what you will. Call it a year and a day if you're a fan of fairy tales. Call it, if you're a scholar of political science, 300 years? But in the end, they did part. They had grown too strange to one another. Janet grew proud and peremptory. She grew to be a greater raving lord than her father had ever been, and she grew to be richer than her father had ever been too, because who would have guessed it? Janet turned out to be the most amazing thief. And on the borders, that was a really good career move. So her men went out fighting, and her coffers were full with other men's gold and silver and treasure. Her name was feared the length and breadth of the borders. And let me tell you, if your name is feared there, your name is pretty cool. Your name could go anywhere, it's feared on the borders. Men trembled when they heard her name, but not as much as her servants trembled when they heard her voice raged in anger, which it was quite often, particularly when she filled her wine cup with too much wine and drank too deep. And through all those years, Tam sat beside her. He did not go out fighting. He decided that wasn't the life for him. He preferred to sit by the fire, to listen to the minstrels singing the old songs, to be lost in some old reverie. But as fast as Janet could win treasure, he would stake it on the turn of a card, on the rattle of the dice. He could never resist a game of chance. His eye kept all its brightness, all its dancing and mockery, although I'm sorry to say his waist did thicken a little. These things happen. And one night, Janet, drinking too deep of the blood-red wine, turned over her cup so it went spilling across the board. And Tam traced an idle finger through the dark red spill, so that their two faces, reflecting there, went dancing, fractured into pieces about the spill, each seeking the parts of itself that were lost. And the next morning, he was gone, turning his back on the tower and walking away, while she stood on the threshold and spat curses after him, spittle flying everywhere and her face red. She didn't care who saw. And of course everybody saw. The servants gathered in the corners to whisper and point and giggle. They knew this had been coming for years. And nobody remembered the child. No one ever remembers the child. But this child grew, even though no one paid any attention. She grew up, she grew brave, she grew strong. She took to wandering by herself among the hills of the borders, where, one day, she met an old woman, a very old woman, who sat beside a yellow bush of broom, a very old woman. The white of her hair clung to the creases of her green gown like spring snow that has lingered too long in the hollows. But when Janet's daughter came closer, she saw that the old woman's eyes were dancing, fire bright. And the old woman's voice, when she spoke, was unbroken, honey sweet. She said, "Hold out your hand, and I'll tell your fortune." And Janet's daughter held out her hand. And the old woman took it and looked for a long time. And then she said, "Yes, I see your fortune. You'll never have your daddy's name. You'll never have your mammy's land. You'll be a stranger in familiar places. The ground will shift under your feet and you won't know where you tread. The old borders will melt away, and new ones will rise invisible in their place, wrapping themselves around your heels and your heart. That's your future, she said. But, she said, I know a place, beyond time, beyond change, where a ripple crossing the skim of a well is all that moves in 100 years. Where your heart will beat as slow and safe as a jeweled toad asleep inside a stone. Will you come with me? Tamlane's child, will you come into my kingdom? And Janet's daughter was not daft. She really wasn't. So she put her hands very carefully into her pockets and she said, "Thank you, that's a very kind offer." "Thank you very much, I'm really very touched. But no thank you, if it's all the same to you." And away she went, running across the borderlands, not looking back, leaping over stone to stone in the mossy places, scrambling up to the steep places, till she stood on the heights of the hills where once in days long ago 2 kingdoms kissed and met and lay down together. And I might have mentioned this, but time in ballads is a queer thing, twisting and stretching itself to fit the shapes of our fancies. And as she ran, time twisted itself around her, and time itself seemed to change, so that when she stood, Janet's daughter, on the top of their hills and looked down at her own self, she saw Wellington boots, jeans, a hoodie, and the wind was rattling a plastic raincoat. Really, you should always wear a raincoat on the borders. Even if it seems like a really nice day, things are always changeable. As I said, this girl was no fool. But something had definitely changed. There was a new scent in the air, a scent of new times, new promises, new dangers perhaps, but certainly things new. And as the wind whistled round her, and as she stood at the top of her world, she called out, Janet's daughter, into that new air, into the new wind that she smelled. She yelled, "So what? So I'll never have my daddy's name. So what? So I'll never have my mummy's land. Who cares for land anyway? So what? So I'll be a stranger in familiar places, but I'll be a familiar stranger, halfway to a friend. And I will roam everywhere, from the breath-gasping pure of the moors to the coal and steel grey of the shipbuilding towns, and then to a whole world beyond. And if the world shifts under my feet, I'll dance. And dancing, my heels and my heart will not be bound by borders. I will sing the old songs, and I will twist them into the shape of my own new dreaming. And I will change as the world around me changes. I will become adder, become Todd, become fire, become dove, become swan, become song. Life. She yelled into the wind. Life is a game of transformations. Every breath, every moment. Life is a song that changes every second as you sing it. And singing, she went. Janet's daughter, Tamlane's child, through the hills and across the borders. And I'll be honest, I don't know exactly where she went. But I do know that she went singing into a new world.